Hello. So this is going to be another episode of ContraRants. I already see some conjecture in the chat that this is going to be some elaborate April Fool's joke. I promise that's not the case. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what I would consider breaking the rules. We all have been, well, I would think most of us have been tempted when we have a piece of music in front of us to play something other than what's written. The question is that only for hacks and people, that are just more interested in having fun, or are there situations where that's not only acceptable but might even be the better option? And here to disagree with me on some of those matters, I have Brett Newton. Say hi.
Hi. Uh, yeah, I'm going to be. Richard called me in for whatever reason to be the voice of reason. I have never been known to be reasonable, but I will take the point of view of the composer at least.
Yeah, and that's at least as far as composition is concerned. So this is not only going to be addressing matters about contrabassooning, but also matters of composition. So it's important to have a composer here. And you also, I think you were talking before that you tend to be a purist. Our job
Yes.
as musicians is to play the music that's on the page, to play the music as the composer intended.
Yeah. So I remember an early bassoon lesson of mine. The teacher basically said ink was expensive. The composer wrote it down. Play what the composer wrote because they spent the time and effort to put it on the page.
Okay.
And that it was said more eloquently, more succinctly than that. But it basically, it's our job as a musician to play exactly what the composer wrote. And I've gotten, especially during grad school, pretty heavily involved in historical interpretations of music and uh, learning a lot about how to interpret what the composers are writing. And I think a lot of that is influenced me personally as a composer. So I'll be interested to see kind of how our views differ, and probably they're going to line up more than anything.
Yeah, well, hopefully there is some disagreement because I think that there's this prevailing myth on the internet that you and I are secretly the same person. So I think if we can make clear some differences, that would help dispel that. Um,
I have not seen that rumor. It would be a scary place if they're making internet rumors about us.
Never underestimate the internet rumor mill. So,
Oh, boy.
my my thoughts on this is that in general, I think that your point of view is absolutely correct. That should be our goal. However, it's not always clear what the composer intended. Nor is it always, nor are we always playing the instrument the composer intended the part to be played on. When a piece is written, or as a contrabassoonist, when we get a piece of music, we are imagining this instrument right here. A 20th century contrabassoon with a range to low B flat. It's entirely possible that the composer was imagining something like this, a Baroque contrabassoon, or something like this, a Romantic era contrabassoon with a range to only to low D, or something like this 20th century contrabassoon with a range to low C, this 20th century contrabassoon with a range to low A, this contrabassoon with bizarre layout of thumb keys, also known as the French contrabassoon, or even the contrabass sarrusophone with a range to concert D flat, or the reed contrabass with a range to low D. So if we are, I don't think it's crazy to consider the possibility that as we're playing on instruments other than that they intended, that there may be some situations where you would play play the passage more suited to the range of the instrument you're using, as opposed to the instrument that the composer may have been written for. So right off the bat, I'm going to start with what I think is a pretty clear example of a composer just kind of assuming a contrabassoon couldn't play something and leaving it out. And so this is from John Adams' Short Ride in a Fast Machine. So if you've played this piece before, you know that at a part towards the middle, the cello, basses, bass trombone, tuba, and contrabassoon start this kind of bizarre walking bass line in kind of disconnected rhythm from the rest of the orchestra. So if you're playing the contrabassoon part, you've been going along for a lot of measures, and then there's this weird rest here. Ba 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 ba. Right? But looking in the other instruments, the tuba and bass trombone both go up to a B flat there, as do the contrabass and the cello. Now, right off the bat, I want to make one distinction here. I think there's two questions. The first question, the easier question to agree upon, I think would be, would a composer have written something differently knowing what they know now, or knowing that a contrabassoonist would be able to play it? And the second question is, should we as a performer, even if we accept that, change what's written? And I think the first one is an easier hurdle to overcome, right? But even the second one, even if you accept in this instance that, yeah, he probably would have written a high B flat if he had considered that part of the contrabassoon's range, but he didn't, so we shouldn't play it.
So this one can actually be answered because John Adams is still alive, and we can actually ask him.
That is an excellent point.
And we can also look at other John Adams pieces. Has he ever written high B flats before? And I would assume he has in the Chamber Symphony.
Yes, but this Short Ride in a Fast Machine was written in 1986.
And when did the Chamber Symphony come out? That was mid-90s, right?
Yeah. So maybe someone changed his mind over the years.
Probably Steve Bronstein.
Yeah, so Chamber Symphony was written in 1992, and that goes up. There's not only high B flats, there's a high B that's staccato and articulated, and it even goes up to high D in a section that includes the excerpt. So now here we also have the benefit of looking at a piece where, regardless of what the contrabassoon does, it's not going to matter as far as the overall orchestral experience. I mean, maybe we're not supposed to admit that, but if the contrabassoonist tacits that note as written or plays that note with the basses, it's going to sound essentially the same to the audience. Maybe the second bassoon player will notice.
I think this is one of those passages where the contrabassoon is playing more for the visual effect on stage than for an audio effect.
Yeah.
Audio effect.
Yeah. So I'll be honest. The past several times I've played this, I've played the high B flat. I didn't see the harm in it because I'm playing anyway. It's not going to be audible one way or another, and I don't know, articulation exercises for a high B flat maybe. I don't know.
I don't personally see a problem. I think this is one of those simple cases where I bet that he just didn't think that the note was going to be feasible at the time. Mm-hmm. Had he written this a little later in his career, I think the high B flat would be there and no one would bat an eye at it.
Yeah. Now, to me, the really odd, let me back up. The really odd thing about this is that he bothered to leave it out, as though I mean, he clearly knew enough about the contrabassoon to imagine that there was this hard cutoff at high A, because a few measures before this, there's a high A. And I'm trying to...
Honestly, I'd rather play the B flat than the A.
Yeah. Tell me about it. At least especially on this instrument. B flat comes out much easier than A. Mm-hmm. And of course, every contrabassoonist who's taken an audition has had to prove that they can play a high B flat as part of Mother Goose.
Right.
Okay. So let's take a look at something else. Now, one issue that plagues early contrabassoon parts is it's not always clear how much input the composer had on the contrabassoon part. A lot of times, the contrabassoon part is, even in the manuscript, is just play with the basses, play with the bassoons, play with the cello. And a editor or someone who's responsible for writing out the parts decides what that means. The best example, or a very obvious example of this, is from Beethoven 9. So now this is from the beginning of the March section in Beethoven 9. So we have these pianissimo B flats. Ba, 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 ba. Now, this is actually, unlike the Atoms, this is very audible. Because, I mean, this is just bass drum, and bassoons. This is one of the relatively very few passages where Beethoven deviates from his usual practice of having the bass, the contrabassoon double the contrabasses. So now, 10, 20 years ago, if someone had played this with all these B flats down an octave, that would be hackery, right? Or the prevailing wisdom would be that they're just, a hack trying to have fun and not thinking about what the composer intended and what it sounds like. But of course, if you've seen a more recent edition of this piece, these B flats are down an octave. And that's because if we look at the original manuscript here, it's hard to read, but the only indication that Beethoven made about what the contrabassoon should play is this right here that says contrafagotto col second bassoon. And the second bassoon has low B flats. Therefore, at least as Beethoven seems to have intended it, the contra should play low B flats. And indeed, so what seems to have happened is the person responsible for writing out a separate contrabassoon part, decided, well, that's silly. Or maybe they knew enough about contrabassoons of the time to know that low B flat wasn't a safe or note. So they took it up an octave. But as more information, or as we have started to look back on the piece, it does seem clear that Beethoven intended a low B flat there. Now, so Brett, on this one, I think we're both going to be in agreement.
I think so. Though it would be interesting to see how that plays out as the part goes further. And I agree, though, that I think the low B flat makes sense. However, we know that the Viennese contrabassoon at the time only went to low C. So it made sense for the publisher not to have the low B flat in there because the instrument couldn't play it. However, if we look at someone like David Chatterton, who is the contrabassoonist for the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, who's playing on a reproduction of a Beethoven-era contrabassoon, he has a low B flat extension that he has for his Viennese contra, just so that he can play this particular note, as well as a low B flat that occurs in Haydn's Creation Symphony.
Yeah,
Symphony, but the Creation.
Now that we're glossing over something that I think is kind of important here. Are we trying? What's more important, realizing the composer's intention, whether or not that was possible at the time, or playing the piece as it was might have been originally performed? Now, I feel like when we're playing on instruments that look like this, it's got to be the latter. It's got to be the composer's intentions are more important than how it was performed at the time. Otherwise, we'd need to do like the what was his name, David Chatterton? Yeah, and have a period instrument.
Right. And I think you can strike a balance between both. I mean, if you're going to use the modern instrument, at least use it with knowledge of historical practices. And I think that is the best solution.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the most important thing to stress here, is that if you ever consider changing the part, it has to be for musical and historical reasons, not simply because, well, I thought a low B flat would be fun here.
Exactly, yes.
Now, different people can come to different decisions on what is musically and historically appropriate, but the reasons do matter.
Yes, you've got to have some kind of basis for your judgment there.
Yeah, but see, I would also argue that dogmatically following the music in front of you, which is, been prepared, the parts were prepared by someone else, it's been, an addition upon an addition, edits upon edits over centuries, that's not necessarily the best approach either.
No, that's one reason I do like, as much as possible, urtext editions. However, urtext are not always possible for certain pieces, simply because we either don't have an original or so many changes were made by the composer themselves that you don't know exactly what the original is.
Yeah, so real quick, I'm just glancing over the second bassoon part. I was curious if there were any low C's in that passage that would prevent the contrabassoon. Well, obviously, a contrabassoonist now who's playing a period Viennese contrabassoon could use an extension, but I'm trying to see if there were any low C's that would have prevented that from being possible back then. Okay, so now while we're on the topic of Beethoven, let's take a look at. So this is from Beethoven 5. We have this arpeggio, right? The one that starts here on middle C. Right? Later in the recapitulation, we have this, the same arpeggio, starting on low C. Now, we could argue about, well, maybe this was a purposeful change. Maybe Beethoven just wanted to mix it up a little bit on the recapitulation. So let's look at the manuscript here. And I think to me, so here's the first example. So we have he has divided the cello and the contrabass line. So he's given the cello its own line up here, down to the low C, da, 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 da. And then he just says to play with the basses after that. The bass, which couldn't play down to low C at that time, and even now it's a little bit hit or miss, depending on the instruments in your section, wrote it an octave higher. In the recapitulation, he hasn't bothered to make that allowance for the range of the bass. So he writes both the cello and the bass down to low C, and that was dutifully copied over to the contrabassoon. Now, there's a pretty convincing argument that the main reason Beethoven started using the contrabassoon was to be able to double the cello an octave lower in this C, D, E flat area where that would have been too low for the basses of the time. So, what does it make much sense for the contrabassoon part to have carried the bass part literally, including the octave shift, or would the contrabassoonist have simply played along with the cello an octave lower down to low C both times?
In this regard, it makes more sense to play it as it is in the second time in the recapitulation.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think that if I played it with the down low C the last time I played the fifth movement.
Now I'll be honest. I normally play this one as written. If for no other reason, it's an audition excerpt. So I might be willing to do some octave switches in a performance, but in an audition, I'm playing what's on the music.
Yes, unless I wonder, have you seen the new Jonathan Del Mar, or there's another new edition, and I wonder if they have the low C in the exposition.
Yeah. Now, see, I've played Beethoven 9 with both some of the older editions and some of the newer editions. Last time I actually played it on an old edition, but I went through and I, penciled in all of the changes from the new edition. Which turned out to have been a really good thing, because do you know that famous moment when there's a bass part that's been left out of the second bassoon part in a lot of the early editions, and it's been added back in. As we were performing, or as we were rehearsing, the conductor started saying, "Come on, second bassoon, go!" And he was staring at a big multi-measure rest. So he was clearly expecting the new edition, even though the orchestra had the old edition.
Yeah.
Now, and if you the more you look at some of the manuscripts on some of these Beethoven and Brahms, or well, Beethoven especially, the more it seems some of these octave choices seem a little haphazard. It has to do with, well, the composer didn't bother with making a separate bass part here, so it ended up in the lower octave, versus when they did. Now, Brahms is sometimes more careful, where he will say that he wants the contrabassoon to double the cello rather than the bass, which kind of makes it clear that he wants the low register. But even then, there's some room for ambiguity. There are passages where he starts off with doubling the bass, and then later on, the bass would go too low, and the cello is playing an octave lower, and then should the contrabassoon continue doubling the bass at the higher octave, or should they double the cello at the lower octave?
In this case, I think we just need to kind of make the best informed decision we can because we don't have a true contrabassoon part. And I think we can go down a path here, and we can talk about Beethoven 6 and 7.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, this is an argument I tried to make to one of my orchestras for next season. I don't think I was successful. But Brett, go ahead and.
Oh, so yeah, we know that contrabassoon exists, at least in the premiere performance of Beethoven 6 and Beethoven 7. Beethoven 6 was premiered on the same concert as Beethoven 5, so the contrabassoonist was there, and most likely reading off of the double bass part. We don't know exactly when it was playing. It could have played the whole entire piece. And we also know for Beethoven 7 at the premiere, there were 2 contrabassoons. So it makes sense to have a contrabassoon playing Beethoven 7 as well.
What was that? There's actually a YouTube video of
like Berlin Phil.
Yeah, done it using 2 contrabassoons, exactly the way that it was originally written. Versus nowadays, the part set or the score doesn't mention contrabassoon, so we dutifully leave it out, even though there's pretty compelling evidence that it would have been used. One of my orchestras is playing Beethoven 7 next season, and I'm not otherwise going to be playing that concert. So I did try to make the argument that, hey, here's the Berlin Phil doing it the way it was originally premiered. You should hire me.
Hey.
Yeah. So now you mentioned something. So Beethoven usually didn't write a separate contrapart. Brahms sometimes did. So this is from Brahms' Third Symphony, and we have this passage here, which goes down all the way down to the lowest B flat. Now, once again, I think there's room for questioning whether that low B flat was actually possible on the instruments that would have been available to Brahms. But if we look at the manuscript, it's not simply a case where he wrote with second bassoon or with basses. He took the time to write a separate contrabassoon line, including the low B flat. In this instance, in the Third Symphony.
There's always speculation on exactly which kind of contrabassoon Brahms was writing for, whether he was writing at this stage for the old Viennese contrabassoon, or if he has the new Heckel contrabassoon in mind. Mm-hmm. And either one is equally likely.
Yeah.
Brahms using the Heckel contrabassoon, though, would be a little surprising for him because he is notoriously conservative in his instrumentation. Mm. So using a very newly developed instrument for Brahms would be unusual. That said, I could see him doing that.
Now, so let's take a similar passage in the Brahms Requiem. So this was written about 20 years earlier. So this is from the second movement. We have all of these very low passages, and the contrabassoon is doubling the cello throughout all of this. Now that does lead a question to these B flats here. The second bassoon has low B flat. So if we assume that the contrabassoon can play low B flat, as Brahms, at least a couple decades later, seems to have assumed it could, he went out of his way to write a separate line going down to low B flat, would it make sense to have the contrabassoon not go to the low B flat there? So once again, if we go to the manuscript, well, unfortunately, this is the closest thing to a manuscript we have for the Requiem. This is a first edition printing. And if we go down to the bottom, we see where Brahms has kind of written down below contrafagot col VC, the violoncello. Now, if we go forward another few bars till we get to the section with the low B flats, so here up in the bassoons we have the octave C's condensed, so we're going to have 3 octaves of C's. The first bassoon, the second bassoon, cello and bass, and then the contrabassoon on bottom, because the contrabassoon was indicated as with the cello. We're going to play that a couple times, and then we're going to get to the B flats. So, to me, it makes sense that I feel like if Brahms had written a separate contrabassoon part here, as opposed to just making a note in the margin, contrabassoon with the cello, that we would have gotten the low B flat there. Now, once again, just because I think that he would have done that doesn't mean I necessarily think that that's how we should play it.
I mean, I could be swayed either way on this. Brahms is starting to get into the territory where we know more about how he was writing for the instrument than Beethoven, and I don't know. This is a much more ambiguous one, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll be honest. Of the times that I played the Brahms Requiem, I haven't done the necessary research to say this definitively, but whatever process Brahms went through to make contrabassoon parts for his symphonies, I feel very strongly a different process was used here. I'd like to make another point here.
I'm wondering though, there's an organ part in the Requiem, correct?
Yes, and
I wonder if that influences things.
So in the manuscript, or in the closest thing to a manuscript, the oldest edition we have, the organ is also indicated as like with the basses or with the choir or something like that. So it's very similar in that regard. Now, the contrabassoon and organ are used in slightly different ways and slightly different times. But, yeah. So,
yeah.
Here is another section from the Brahms Requiem. that I would use as evidence of the contrabassoon part for this piece being not up to Brahms' standard for the other symphonies. So specifically, I'm going to need to zoom out here. I need to zoom out even more. Sorry, that's going to be hard to read. So this passage here, so we have these measures repeated in the same octave. Now, if we look at the bass parts, the cello and bass parts, we see that these two measures are continually moving upward. They repeat at the octave, up to this top A flat. Now, we know from Beethoven, from Brahms 3, that he was comfortable writing contra up to A flat or A. Now, I haven't found any evidence that he wrote that high for contrabassoon when he, was writing its own independent staff. It comes about from, just play with the basses, play with the cello. But regardless, he was clearly comfortable writing up to that high A flat on contrabassoon. But here, the editor has kind of taken it upon themselves to just take it down an octave, leaving the contrabassoon alone in this octave in an orchestral tutti. And that's a situation I just don't think is likely to as intended. Now, if we go back earlier in the manuscript, we see that the only indication we have is contrabassoon sempre with the bass. So, to me, with the evidence we have, it looks like this was just an editor making an executive decision to take it down an octave. Any thoughts on?
No, I completely agree with you. I think that the edition that's shown on the screen, the printed one, probably is wrong in this case. And if we go back to the earlier versions, that it should be up the octave.
Yeah, and there's a lot of mistakes, or well, not necessarily mistakes. There's a lot of odd things in this piece. One of my plans is I want to make a new edition of the contrabassoon part to this piece, to kind of bring it more in line with the rest of the Brahms symphonies, how they use contrabassoon. There's even one moment where the contrabassoon is marked with the cello, so sounding, an octave below the bass, even if it goes below, or sounding an octave below the cello, even if it goes below the range of the bass. But then the bass drops out when it would have had to go too high, like up to tenor clef C. So this edition keeps the contrabassoon in the bass, or with the cello, with as opposed to resting with the basses, leaving the contrabassoon the only instrument playing in this playing that octave, which once again
doesn't make sense.
Is not how Beethoven and Brahms used contra.
Right.
Okay. So, I guess while we're on this topic, I probably should talk about one of my less defensible edits that I have personally been guilty of. Let me pull this up. So this is also from the Brahms Requiem. So you mentioned that there's an organ to this on this piece. Now, we all know that organs, maybe there was a time when every concert hall of note had a world-class organ in it, but that's definitely not the case anymore. So anytime there's an organ part, it can end up, disappointing because it's either left out or just Um,
Not powerful enough, or using an electric one.
yeah. Now, Ardre actually has so, Brett,
Yeah.
this might be a good question for you.
So in your opinion, is it always more important to follow the composer's attention than to provide the best possible experience for the modern listener? I don't think those two options are mutually exclusive. I think we have the responsibility to follow the composer's intention to create the best possible experience for the listener.
Yeah, but I definitely think it's while I agree that they're not necessarily in contradiction, I do think they can be, especially if a composer was writing for an instrument significantly different than the instrument that is being used in modern performances.
Yes. But I think as performers, we kind of have that responsibility, though, to get as close to the composer's ideal as possible. And I think some players go along those lines, and others don't. And
The,
I
the,
think
pe-
it
the
very
people that
much
just play low notes because they like playing low notes.
exactly. And there's one particular instrument that's very guilty of doing that.
Oh, come on, name names.
The tuba players, yeah. I mean, we look at tuba players; they are notoriously guilty of American tuba players, not tuba players typically in other parts of the world, but American tuba players. I've heard them affectionately referred to as tuba jocks, who use the biggest equipment possible to make the biggest sound possible to drown out everybody.
Well, yeah, because they're playing a part that was originally written for ophicleide, so of course it needs a double C six quarters tuba played fortissimo, right?
Right.
So this is what I would consider one of my less defensible changes that I have done in my career. So this is the ending of the second movement of the Brahms Requiem, and we have this. This descending passage, descending between the first bassoon into the second bassoon, down to the contrabassoon, and then if we go down to the strings, we see the same thing, descending through the strings all the way down to the basses, and then this final note. Now, if we look at the organ part, there's a B flat here. It's rested for a while, and then there's this, on the organ, the lowest B flat it can produce, right? I don't see, there's no specific indication of registration throughout this. And of course, the organ part wasn't, this is someone else's realization of the organ part using Brahms' instructions of when to play. Now, so what I have done is take this last B flat, absolutely pianissimo, down an octave. In my mind, kind of recreating what we've lost from not having this giant organ playing, like even if an organ's playing softly, it has a lot of presence to it. And in my mind, playing that last B flat an octave lower, softly enough that people aren't even going to notice it. Like, you don't want anyone in the audience to say, whoa, they took that down an octave. You want them to feel like, okay, yeah, something was added at that last note. It should have been an organ playing, 16 or 32 foot stops, moving a lot of air. But in this case, it's a contrabassoon playing a low B flat.
I do not disagree with that, because if you don't have the organ there, you are filling in a note that otherwise would be there.
Well, not necessarily, because even if we accept that Brahms was intending, a decent organ, it's far from clear that it would have been an organ with a 32-foot stop capable of playing that low B flat.
True. This might be an interesting topic of discussion, though. What organs was Brahms familiar with? Was a 32-foot stop a fairly standard organ registration in 1800s Vienna? And I would think that in the larger churches, it probably was.
So what I'm seeing here is that the first performance of the first partial first performance of 6 movements was in the Bremen Cathedral. I wonder, Bremen Cathedral organ registration? Sometimes weird stuff like this is available online.
You would be surprised. I bet you've got it. And
So,
strangely, the composer I would look to for stuff like that is really one of the composers we would think of being very antithetical to Brahms, and it would be Bruckner. You look to Bruckner for his organ scoring, and I would almost guarantee you Bruckner's using 32 foots.
Yeah, it's possible. As a contrabassoonist, I don't play much Bruckner because
he only wrote for it in the Eighth Symphony.
Yeah. Or I guess I should say I've never played any Bruckner. So even though he's known as one of these stereotypical, giant orchestra composers,
he's not really.
Yeah.
Though. Above and beyond, a standard orchestra is, he uses 8 horns, and that's really the only difference. And he only does that in symphonies 7, 8, and 9.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it is a totally standard orchestra.
Now, there is one other moment. Once again, I'm going to keep on picking on the Brahms Requiem because the parts are so crazy. If we look at the contrabassoon part, the 7th movement, and this is the only way I've seen it in any edition was like this. The contrabassoon plays until before B, and then it's tacit the rest of the movement. But if we go back to, once again, not the manuscript, but this early edition that's been where Brahms has indicated where the contrabassoon should play, we see that beginning in the 3rd measure after the F major key change, contrabassoon with the bass. And then that continues for 6 full pages before the contrabassoon is finally tacited through the rest of the piece. And that's not until after D. So there's this whole section between C and D that Brahms seems to have indicated, but that's left out of modern editions. Now, once again, well, I guess I shouldn't say once again, I think it's worth noting that we may not have all the information here. This one document is not the end-all and be-all. For all we know, there was a second document where Brahms said, whoa, that's too much contrabassoon. Cut that section. And we've just never gotten that. But based on the evidence we have, it seems like the contrabassoon should be playing a decent chunk of the seventh movement. But even then, I would argue that there's a question for, well, what about this? Here, the contrabassoon has been indicated, as doubling the bass. Should it go up a minor 7th with the basses, or should it go down with the cellos? See, I think a lot of times Brahms uses with the basses when there's a separate bass part, but that doesn't. I don't think that necessarily always means that he intended it to be in the. I think that here we might have a case where he simply didn't bother to write, okay, except for this one note with the cello, but then back with the bass. And then there's another thing at the very end where, once again, now do we go up with the basses or down with the cellos. And this one's even more confusing because if we went down with the cellos, then we'd be adding a new low octave and cutting it off early, as opposed to how it's written, the bass just kind of fades away in the same octave as the cello. So even though these two passages look similar, I think I might have different opinions on the best way to perform them.
This is fascinating to me seeing this, and I absolutely agree. I think you do need to prepare a new contrabassoon edition for this piece because it is so ambiguous.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's jump ahead quite some time to Prokofiev. And so this is the piece that this was actually the last piece I performed before everything got shut down, Prokofiev 5. And this is the piece that kind of got me starting to think about this video. Now, as we go through this piece, it's pretty clear to me that Prokofiev was writing with a low C contra in mind. Throughout the piece, he avoids anything below C. And I think the best illustration, or a decent illustration of that, is this ending of the first movement. We have this long descending line, D, C sharp, B, F sharp, D, C sharp, and then jumping up to B flat. Now, that is what the basses do, but of course, even a bass with extensions can't play down to B flat. But what does the piano do? D, C sharp, low B flat. Not only low B flat, but low B flat tremolo. So, once again, the two questions. If Prokofiev knew that this piece was going to be played on an instrument with low B flat, would he have written low B flat? And second, should we change it even if we accept that?
So Prokofiev is notoriously bad about his instrumental writing. And I literally mean the actual writing on the page. He does not use transposing instruments in the score. He's really the originator of the C score. So we don't really see scores in C before Prokofiev. So you look at your clarinet parts and it just will say clarinet, and he doesn't care if it's an A clarinet or a B flat clarinet or a C clarinet. And so it's just going to say clarinet, and he doesn't care. Which gets to issues, particularly something like Peter the Wolf. A clarinet player shows up, plays it, and there's a low concert C sharp. And so they hand him a B flat part, and it's got a written low E flat. It's like, clarinet can't play that note. Clearly he was thinking A clarinet, but didn't care. It didn't write it in.
Well, or he considered that someone else's job. Now, like, for me, what strikes me as odd about this is I think it would be easier to attribute this to a lack of care if he had just followed another instrument. Like, let's say that he went down to low B flat. I think it would be easier to attribute that to, well, he just doubled the second bassoon and he didn't bother to take into account that the contrabassoons of the time, or the contrabassoon he had available to him, couldn't play low B flat. So he seems to have deliberately distorted this line to avoid these low notes that on a modern instrument are completely possible. So where does that leave us? We kind of have two conflicting ideas here. Like, to me, it makes sense that this piano line that he is using the piano to do what the contrabassoon cannot, to continue this line down to the lowest B flat.
Right. I think you are justifiable in this point in playing the low B flat. So you have to wonder when this was written, what the state of Russian contrabassoons were. Were there even many contrabassoons in Russia at the time? And I can't imagine that there were. They would have been this extreme luxury item.
Yeah, and I would imagine they would have looked more like this. The probably older than this, but
right. You don't see. There's no Russian tradition of contrabassoon. Rimsky-Korsakov uses it very late in his career, and it's really only the works after 1900. He doesn't make much use of it at all. You don't see it in a lot of the other Russian composers. You might see it occasionally in Glazunov. Prokofiev uses it. Shostakovich uses it, but
and Shostakovich uses it very well.
Yes, he does. So there had to have been at least one good contrabassoonist in Russia at the time. Probably in Leningrad, I would think. And was Prokofiev in Moscow and Shostakovich was in Leningrad?
I, off the top of my head, I do not know that.
It could be the differences in the two instruments used between those two cities.
Yeah.
That's like doctoral level research.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so if I've tempted you this much to the dark side, let's see if I can tempt you a little bit further. This is earlier in the first movement, where we have a similar situation. We have this line in the piano in octaves in the lowest register, ending on this low A. And sure enough, the contrabassoon enters on that A, and joining the basses. Now the basses are in unison for that first note. Obviously they couldn't play the low A. But then immediately afterwards, they divide in octaves. So, would he have written the low A if he believed it to be possible to bolster the piano and then went up a minor seventh to create the lower octave of this bass part?
This is, in this case, I think the upper A is probably the more defensible position, what's written in the score, because if you think about what the piano's doing, that low A is not going to be as audible just simply because it's so full of upper harmonics. It becomes much more of a percussive effect.
But maybe that's why the contrabassoon needs to play that note.
But then you look at the line that follows, and it's A, G, and then I don't know what comes next on the next page.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have this, it stays in that area, like A, G. It doesn't leap up and down.
Yeah. I would think that it would be more important to keep that line there in as going forward.
Yeah, but he does. I mean, like that, the half of the basses are. I feel like if the line was a major second down, he would have had the basses up an octave, or the divisi start from the beginning of that passage.
So you're saying the melodic contour is actually not downward of a second, but upward of a seventh.
I am suggesting that that's possible, and that interpretation also allows you to bolster the low A in the piano.
Okay. If that is your interpretation, and that's one that you can really, be justified with, the low A may make more sense. Is it a fragment? Is it a motif that we've heard throughout the rising seventh? If that's the case, yes. If instead we've heard it as a falling second, then this is one of those where you need to look at it from really more of a theoretical point.
Yeah, so that's a good point. I'm trying to... Where would that be if that were... Okay. Is there any... Okay. Yeah, I'd need to do some more research on that to see what's happened beforehand on this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I guess I should also say here that as performer, this particular change, even though I'm kind of the opinion that he would have written a low A if it had been possible, that's a very dangerous thing to do in performance, because not only are you playing a note not written that's going to be audible, you're adding for a lot of players, you're adding a visual cue that you're doing something wrong by the use of a low A extension.
Right.
So you would need to be darn sure of yourself or your conductor before... This would be very, very, very dangerous, I would say. That said... We do know Prokofiev has used low A's in bassoons before. Mm-hmm.
What is it, Third Piano Concerto?
I know I've played a low A in Prokofiev before. I cannot for the life of me remember where it is. Honestly, whenever I'm playing Prokofiev on bassoon, I'm just annoyed at treble clef.
Yes, that's one of those notation issues that Prokofiev never used tenor clef for any instrument.
So here's another Prokofiev excerpt. Once again from Fifth Symphony. So we have this line here in the basses. B, G, F, B, G, F, B, G, F, repeated. All right? Now we go up to the contrabassoon. We have B, G down to F, B, G down to F. And if we look at all of the other bassline instruments, there's that seventh, the leap of the seventh between the G and the F. Here in the low register of the piano. Even in the timpani, that couldn't do the low B, it does leap up. The tuba goes up to the F. So we've talked a lot about playing things down an octave, but to me, this would be a good place to argue that he just didn't think the high F was feasible, so he wrote it down, which once again, we're going to end up in that issue that kind of where we have an orchestral tutti where the contrabassoon is playing the low octave all by itself.
Here is something that's, I think, much more interesting is the fact that the contrabassoon part is not... It may have the same pitches, but it's very different articulation.
Mm-hmm.
The
pizzicato versus... Yeah.
Right. And so you've got this slur, these long notes. Could you scroll up? Let me see what the woodwinds are doing there.
I'm going to have to open that separately.
Oh, is that one you sent me?
Yeah, this is just
I got it.
well, I didn't send you the full score though.
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah. But I don't know. In this case, I think I would actually play the ink here,
Okay.
um, because of just the textural difference.
Yeah, but so I guess to me, what would what would be more compelling isn't some maybe not so much the basses because we're dealing with pizzicato, um, but like the tuba.
Right.
Let's see if I can find that real quick without. Okay. Should have organized this better.
But even still, um, it to me feels like a different contrapuntal line in the contrabassoon because of how it's articulated. This just is so it feels so different that you are functioning differently than everybody
And
else.
see, I'd be more inclined to chalk that up to he was worried the contrabassoonist couldn't do the articulation. To me, this looks like someone tried to make a part easier for the contrabassoonist, and that's why it ended up different, rather than a purposeful difference. And that includes the articulation as well as the range.
Right. So that it is a confusing passage. This is why score study for an orchestral musician is so important.
Yeah.
Because you see this in the part and you're just going to play it as is, but it's so counter everything else going on in the rest of the passage.
And even if you take for granted that you're going to play it as is, which is always going to be the safer option, right? Your default should be like, even if you accept my dark side interpretations that maybe there's a few possibilities for taking things up or down the octave, the default should be playing it as written. But even if you do play it as written, well, Brett, what you said was exactly right. You would need to know that you're playing by yourself in that octave, in that articulation. That's going to affect, that should impact how you play it.
And I wonder if this passage comes up in rehearsals. Say, I almost would wonder if it will be heard as somebody playing a mistake.
Yes, that's my thought as well, because the contrabassoon is doing a unique articulation in a unique octave, and without any support whatsoever from the other instruments.
Because it's the only low instrument that has any kind of sustain there.
Yeah. So yeah, is it going to sound like the contrabassoon is just zoned out? And once again, this would come down to score reading, because if you were going to play this, now when I played this, I did play the high F, but I played the slur as well. But I knew that I was the only instrument that was slurring here, and so I played it with maybe a little more gusto than I might if I knew that I was, playing articulation with everybody else, and I might be more worried about blending with the other instruments.
Right.
Okay. So one final Prokofiev example here. We have some more low note stuff. So these are the low reeds. Actually, so Arte brings up something interesting. He says, I play in an amateur orchestra, so I would ask the conductor about changes like these. Is it different in a professional orchestra? I would say the main difference is the conductor's time is more valuable. So if you're coming, you don't want to be the person that comes to the conductor with a list of like 18 questions. You with your one-on-one time with the conductor, you want to make sure that you both come away from that feeling like, okay, that was a good interaction. That was a good use of both of our time. Like one of the worst things you can do in a professional orchestra if you had these kind of questions is like raise your hand. Hey, what octave should I play this in? And waste 80 people's time.
Right. Yeah.
So if you did have questions about this, I would say it would need to reach a pretty high bar before I think it would be worthwhile going to the conductor. Like if it's something that's going to possibly be audible, yeah, an octave choice is going to make a big difference if you have good reason to doubt what's going on. But just being perfectly honest, if you're going to go up to the conductor at break and try to give them a 5-minute lecture on the ranges of historical contrabassoons, and that's just not. The conductor has more pressing matters to worry about. So most of these issues, I would take it more on myself of, I'm hired as a contrabassoon specialist, and in my mind, score study is part of that. And like these are more ambiguous situations where we're dealing with, maybe not mistakes, but maybe things that wouldn't have been done if the instrument wasn't. If we were dealing with modern instruments, but there's a lot of things that are just like clear mistakes. Like you're not going to go up the conductor and say every time and say, "Hey, I'm missing an accidental here. Do you want the parallel major sevenths with the second bassoon, or is it okay if I change this?" You're going to, just say, "Okay, that's wrong. I'm going to fix it."
Right. I think you're correct that you've got to have that threshold to get to before you really need to go and talk to the conductor.
Now,
that said, there are things that you do need to talk to the conductor on.
Yes, like the low A flat in Neptune that I play a lot of times when we're dealing with a cruddy little synthesized organ. That's not something I just do, because that's going to be audible. It's very visible that I'm doing something crazy, and I'm not going to just do that without asking.
Right.
All right. So here's a. This is, once again, we have a question of what the musical line is. Is the line what's presented in the contrabassoon? Or is it what's presented in the second bassoon, or the first and second bassoon, where it goes down to the low B and up to C sharp?
I think it's pretty clear in this case.
Okay. Now, what if we look at the piano and harp?
Well, I'll have to look at them.
So the piano and the harp do jump down to the low B in C sharp.
Interesting.
Now, and I would argue there's even a third interpretation here. The line is A flat up to B up to C sharp, but the piano can't play the low A flat. So the line is how it appears in the cello and bass and the bass clarinet and contrabassoon, but he wanted it also to be doubled in the low octave as much as possible.
In this case, I think the simplicity of line is the most important thing here.
Mm-hmm.
And the piano and the harp are just coming in as color.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I would play the part exactly as written.
Okay. Yeah. So to me, I guess my counter would be there are plenty of other instruments playing this line. A flat up to B up to C sharp. But there really aren't any other instruments that can give the low B and the low C sharp the body that the contrabassoon can. So, like, I mean, he clearly broke that line in order to bolster the low register in the bassoons. So yeah, this is definitely one of the more out on a limb examples I could find.
Yeah, I don't see any reason to change what's written there, because the preponderance of the players are playing the ascending line, A flat up to B.
Yeah, but the players
particularly because of how the low reeds have a different rhythm on that than everybody else.
But the players that can play in the low octave are, or at least the players that he assumed could.
If that's the case, then you should see the cello playing the low C sharp.
Yeah, and so that's the other counter is that the contrabassoon is not playing the low C sharp.
Right. And so I think therein is really kind of all the evidence you need is that because the cello's not doing the low C sharp, that the line here is more important, and that the piano and harp are just color.
Okay.
So, and I think you also look at what they're doing in the right hand, particularly the piano in the right hand. You couldn't really have. Well, I mean, I guess you could have it without the octava, but you don't have as much sonic room.
Okay, yeah, I think yeah, no, okay. I kind of see. I see what you're saying. To me, I think if the contrabassoon were capable of playing low A flat.
Oh yes, I think in this case you might have an argument there, as well as the bassoons. Mm-hmm. But because you don't have that, I don't think it makes sense to drop all of it.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked a lot about, cases of ambiguity that arise from composers who are writing for instruments that don't have the same capabilities as the instruments that we take for granted now. I wanted to also kind of showcase some composers that did make this allowance and told exactly what to do, or told the player exactly what to do in these situations. So this is from Berg's chamber concerto for violin, piano, and wind instruments. And we have this. So this is the contrabassoon line that goes down all the way down to the low B flat. The score is written in sounding pitch, which is why there's a ottava bassa on all of this. And he's specifically indicated in here that if the contrabassoon cannot play the low notes, that there's this other line to play that doesn't go down that only goes down to like low D and then continues up for there. He also makes it clear which one he prefers, because one is in small notes and one is in big notes. Well, and also the words, I guess, also make that clear as well. So to me, this is what, as a performer, what I would like to see more of, especially for the low A. Because as more instruments come around that are capable of playing down to low A, as a contrabassoonist who has a low A extension, if a composer wants a low A, I want to play the low A. I want them to get the note that they want, not to assume that the note that they want isn't possible, unless it's not possible, in which case, that's a safe assumption. Now, earlier in the piece, there's an even more extraordinary example of this, where he has... here, let me get that centered. He's written a passage to avoid this low B flat, but he's also told 3 other players how to play their part differently if the contrabassoonist can't play the low B flat. Now, in modern music, this would be completely unnecessary because we assume that contrabassoons can play down to low B flat. But when Berg wrote this, that was not a safe assumption. So he let everyone know exactly what he wanted and then provided an option if that wasn't possible.
Fascinating. I've never seen this before.
Yeah, this is one of those things that probably appears in contrabassoon excerpt books 90 times more often than it's actually performed.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Schoenberg that's like this.
Yes. Schoenberg and Berg contrabassoon parts are just nasty.
And see, I keep on. After having had to work up the Kammer Symphony No. 1 for an audition, I want to actually play the darn thing.
And what's funny is you've worked it up. I've played it.
Yeah.
And I didn't have time to work it up.
Yeah, I've heard this story. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no. So the contrabassoonist involved in performance of the Schoenberg Chamber Symphony backed out like 2-3 days before the concert. Said, "Nope, I can't play it." And so it's like, "Right, you got to come play this piece." Oh, great! Most difficult piece in the standard repertoire. Good.
So, and then there was another example of a composer that understood the. So, like, as a composer, you kind of have competing interests in mind. You want to make certain that, you want the best possible version of your piece to be heard, but you also don't want to give players the impression that you don't understand the limitations of their instrument. So, sure, if you write a low A, a player who sees that, who doesn't have a low A, is just going to play it up an octave. But they might also judge the composer slightly harshly and look at this numbskull who doesn't know that contrabassoons only go down to low B flat. Or maybe not necessarily the player, but maybe a conductor or someone with less hands-on experience with the contrabassoon. So this is an example from the Saint-Saens Wedding of Prometheus, where he's just made a little note here that if the contrabassoonist can play the low B flat, they can. That they accept that low B flat as an option. He doesn't really specify which one he prefers. And in fact, I think Brett can tell this story better than I can. The original performance, no contrabassoon was used. So I think
correct.
So go ahead.
Yeah, so the original performance of this piece is actually pretty strange. This was Saint-Saens' winning piece for, I believe it was the winning piece for the Prix de Rome, and he was supposed to have a performance of it by the Paris Conservatoire. And for whatever reason, they decided to balk at that and said, nope, we're not going to perform it. Um, and so what did Saint-Saens do? He hired his own orchestra and said, we're going to perform this piece. I won the Prix de Rome. I want to perform my winning piece. And he had parts for a contrabassoon in it. Well, in Paris at the time, 1867, nobody had a contrabassoon. They did have a sarrusophone, though. And so out of his own pocket, Saint-Saens bought the sarrusophone. And that was what was used for the premiere performance, which, by the way, is probably to this date still the only performance of this piece. I can find no performance of this piece after the premiere of it in 1867. Now, what's interesting about the piece is it also uses a pair of saxophones as well as a contrabass trombone, pre-Wagner. So it's a highly unusual piece, and as conservative as we think Saint-Saens is, he absolutely was one of the most radical composers in Paris at the time.
So before we end up, so Brett, this is confessional time. Have you ever personally played? Well, okay. I know there is an answer to this. I know that you've played something other than what's written at least once, because I know that you played the Beethoven Fifth on sarrusophone.
Yes, so that was just out of necessity in undergrad because I wanted to play in the orchestra. They were doing Beethoven 5. The university had no contrabassoon. We did have a sarrusophone, and I asked the conductor. He said, I don't want a sousaphone playing that. He didn't even know what a sarrusophone was. And the conductor, he's verified the story too.
Yeah. So the conductor that Brett's talking about was Ron Spiegelman. He's the regular pops conductor for the Tulsa Symphony. So I've played with him many times. I've played, yeah. He was actually the guy who we were rehearsing the planets, and we got to Neptune, and he looks at the score and then looks at the little keyboard, and he gets my attention and says, hey, I have this really weird thing to ask. I don't know if you're going to be able to do it, and if you can't, that's absolutely not a problem. But there's this one really low note in Neptune, and we're not going to have it on the organ. Is there any way? And I just said, yep, got it. And I picked up my low A flat extension that was under my chair just for that very purpose. And he started trying to tell me, okay, so you come in this minute. It's like, no, I already have it penciled in my music as something that I was, prepared to do. So
yeah, he's a good guy.
Yeah. So,
but have I ever taken notes down an octave or up the octave? Yeah, I absolutely, when I was playing contrabassoon. I don't think I ever did it though in a professional setting. It was always in school settings.
Yeah, when it's kind of like fun. Yeah.
Yes. When it's not this serious mega work, I never did it when I was doing the planets or Shostakovich 5 or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, there were times when if you have this big full tutti chord in the orchestra and you can take the part down an octave,
Yeah, so
I think a lot of contrabassonists will admit to that one,
and I think even more of them will not admit to it. But they know the truth.
Yeah.
Speaking of what you just said, these big, massive final chords, here is what I've always considered one of the weirder moments. This is the ending of Brahms 1. Why is that not a low C? I mean, I usually play it. at least professionally, I play it as written because it's not written low C. He used low C earlier in the piece, so we know that, he knew it was an option. But it works so much better as a low C for that final note.
I think this is probably the case where he was just writing col basso. And if you just go back and look at the manuscript, it'll just say contrabassoon col basso.
Yeah. So, hold on. I can look that up while we chat real quick. All right. Any other? So yeah, for me, this and the last note of Academic Festival Overture, and it's always funny for me because at least on 3 different occasions at rehearsal, when I've just on a lark played the low C, I've had string players compliment it. It's like, oh, that last note sounds great. And it's like, oh, no one was supposed to hear me do that.
The thing is, the low C will be felt. It won't be heard, but it'll be felt.
Yeah, so once again, I think the correct answer here is the printed octave. Because early, when we did look at the manuscript of Brahms 1, and I'm pulling it up now to look at the ending and see what exactly went on, he would go out of his way to write a separate contrabassoon part if necessary.
Right. But it's not always, the full separate contrabassoon part. A lot of times it is just the shorthand.
All right.
We don't really get someone writing a full separate contrabassoon part really until Strauss and Mahler.
Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and pull this over here.
Can you think of any other composer before Strauss or Mahler who is writing an independent contrabassoon part throughout the duration of a piece?
No, not off the top of my head. Okay, so this is our answer. Right here we have the contrabassoon line, and it's been written with the cello. And the cello is just with the bass. So we have like a double dependency here. So that's the justification for that low C, as Ratchet mentioned just 6 bars before, is because that's in the cello part. And then he immediately says for the cellos to move back, that the cello line rejoins the bass line. And then we get to the ending, where it's just written, the basses and cello are all playing that C.
And no contrabassoon really indicated.
Well, I'm assuming that the with cello still applies from before.
Right.
So, yeah, that's where it came from. As an orchestrational choice, I just feel like it's disappointing.
Yeah. I would agree here that, you kind of want that huge low C at the end. Mm-hmm. He didn't write it. He probably should play it as he wrote it, but man, there's something compelling about wanting to play that ultra low C.
Or the other option, which is just play the low C and then swear that you didn't.
Just say it's a resultant tone.
Yeah, I was just so in tune that you could hear the low C.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so Colin says the bass could also play that low C with an extension. At the time, extensions weren't a thing. So that's why Brahms goes out of his way to write, to separate out the cello and the bass parts in some instances, is because you couldn't, the bass couldn't play notes below E or sometimes even G, depending on how many strings it was using, without retuning the low string. And Brahms did use that. He had the basis tuned down to D in the Requiem. He specifically indicates it. But for just like for more technical situations, you couldn't get away with that. With retuning a note just for one note. So that's actually one of the earliest justifications for the contrabassoon in the orchestra was its ability to play down to low C or even low B flat, filling in the octave below the bass, or sorry, the octave below the cello.
Right, because early double basses, didn't, well, it depends on where you're talking about the double bass, because, you in the Baroque era, you've been using the violone, which would have gone down to D. But by the classical era, you've got, really, Beethoven is writing more for Dragonetti, who's using a 3-string bass, which only goes down to G.
Yeah, and Beethoven does go down to F and E pretty frequently, especially as he gets into his later works. But there's actually... I might as well plug this. Hold on. So this is a very interesting thesis that I think is worth looking at for anyone who's kind of interested in these topics. It's by, the author's name is Stephen Buckley, and he talks a lot about exactly these issues of the range of the bass at these times, the use of the contrabassoon to fill in. He even goes into detail on the fact that 2 contrabassoons were listed on the premiere of Beethoven 7 and 8, like Brett and I talked about. So if you're interested in this is it's worth reading. That's Stephen Buckley's Beethoven's Double Bass Parts, the Viennese Violone, and the Problem of Lower Compass. So Arte did have one. So Arte was getting back to his composer's intentions versus the best experience of the audience, and he was pointing out that this low C at the end of Brahms 1 might be a very good example of that disconnect. The composer clearly intended the octave higher, but I do think there's a good case to be made for it's a better performance with the low C, assuming the low C is in tune. So, and I don't think we can answer that. I think that, but I do think that this illustrates that those two goals are not always 100% in sync.
Yeah, my brain's going weird places. I'm actually thinking about visual art, and do we present the painting with slightly different colors than the artist originally painted it with?
Well,
and
almost by necessity, because the colors change over time.
Yeah, and so with music, there is no 100% true answer is this is what it sounds like. Music is always about the interpretation, and if we only had one version of each piece, I don't think the pieces would live as much as they do.
So are you live on YouTube, prepared to say that it's valuable for players to do different things and present different versions of pieces?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think.
But maybe not including changing notes or
right. I mean, the classic case of that is the Glenn Goldberg variations, which he recorded 2 or 3 times, and they're so different from each other. Same performer, same piece, totally different music.
Now there he had the advantage or disadvantage, depending on how you look at it, of the composer being long dead. No one could object.
Right.
Now, sometimes the composer being alive is a great thing. You can actually ask them. I've done that before. There's a CD floating around of me playing that I play a low A on, because I looked at the score and I asked the composer, did you intend a low A here? It kind of looks like it. And he said, oh yeah, but I know that that's not possible. And I was like, all right, well, I can play it if you want it. And yeah. So Ratchet's bringing up. Brett, are you familiar with this piece?
Barque sur l'Océan? Yeah. It's one of Ravel's most difficult piano works, and Ravel wrote G sharps in the piano.
Oh, okay, I think I have seen a reference to that. So Ratchet, we're kind of focusing, probably to a fault, on contrabassoon matters. Now, I'm curious, did he do an orchestration of it?
Yes, he did.
So
he retracted it, though.
Okay. So how did he handle the low G sharps there?
I'm not sure. I'd have to look at it. My guess my guess is it's in the double bass and contrabassoon.
But an octave higher.
Yeah. Ravel himself did not like his orchestration of that piece.
Okay. So
you don't see it very often. It's one of those lost Ravel pieces. There's a few obscure and lost Ravel pieces that we just really don't know a lot about. Turns out the last piece he was working on was a wind band piece.
That sounds like something that you're still sad about.
Salty about. Yeah. But yeah. He had his last work was a commission for the Franco Goldman Band. Been absolutely fascinating to see what he did for wind band.
Okay. Yeah, so I think would take a little more time than we have to kind of tear through this piece and try to figure out. I don't even know where the low G sharps technically existed. Okay. So here I'm looking at the piano version. I'll glance over it real quick, see if I can see any excessively low notes. Okay, there's a B flat 0, more B flat zeros, B flat zeros.
If I remember correctly, it's a pretty fleeting note. It's like a 16th note or something.
Yeah, I see a lot of these, like, oh, okay. Yeah, there it is. So right here on the downbeat here. So let's see, can we find that in his orchestration? A 2/4 bar. Okay, I think this is it. Right here. So yeah, we just have normal. So he's preserved the octave leap in the basses, but he's just taken it up an octave. And the contrabassoon, if there is even a contrabassoon in this arrangement, does not come into play. And of course, there's no orchestral instrument that can easily play that note. Tuba players will swear that they can until you ask them to demonstrate it, and then
and the tuba of Ravel's time wouldn't.
Yeah. Okay, so Brett, unless there's any other examples you wanted to bring up or confessions you wanted to make?
There is one fascinating bassoon passage from a work of Weber that I think really kind of illustrates this. So when Weber was writing, the bassoons obviously still did not have a low B natural and a low C sharp.
Mm.
So there's a passage in one of the pieces,
But of course, composers
where
weren't always very meticulous about making that distinction. They did sometimes just write low B's and C sharps, and
in this case, though, Weber was meticulous and just left those notes out.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got the passage going. First bassoon plays the complete line. Second bassoon down the octave, leaves out the B natural, the C sharp.
What was the name of the piece?
I can't remember. I'll have to go and look it up.
Okay.
But so you've got this passage going, and just where it should be a B natural or a C sharp, the notes are just left out. I would think as a modern performer, you would probably fill those notes in, because the bassoon can now play those notes.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, and if I had to guess, I'd say that there's probably some modern editions that just kind of take it for granted.
Yeah.
Okay, the repeated use of the low C sharp in Romance is greatly facilitated on the German instrument. That doesn't seem like an orchestral piece it's talking about. Okay, so Dibbs is saying the tuba hating. We don't hate tubas. I love the tuba, and I will say that I am lucky in that in the orchestras I play with, the tuba players are absolute top notch. Jared Robertson, the tuba player in the Tulsa Symphony, fantastic player. But I do think it's kind of hard to not remember some of those college tuba players. The ones that went on to become like real estate agents instead of symphonic tuba players that, just played everything as loud as possible, drowning out everybody.
Yeah. No, but yeah, that gets back to what I call, a tuba jock.
Yeah.
And, the tuba players that I talk to when I go to information are absolutely not tuba jocks. They're right instrument for the right job guys.
Yeah, and when I was talking about tuba players swearing that they can, play low G sharp no problem, I'm mainly talking about like college people on the internet. Professionals are more likely to say, "Oh man, I can play that note, but I'm not sure you're going to like the sound."
Right.
As opposed to, "I can play that note easy, blah 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 blah. I can play lower than anybody in the orchestra." Sure you can, but is it in tune? Professionals usually acknowledge the limitations of that register, whereas the tuba jocks Brett's talking about, maybe not so much.
Right. Yeah, you don't in professional orchestras, you don't see tuba parts really going much below D1. And even when you get down to D1, you're starting to get into no man's territory on tuba parts. And then there are tuba players who say, "Oh, I can play down an octave lower than that."
Yeah.
But it doesn't. You lose your intonation.
I'll put it this way. Most of the time, tuba players that I've worked with, by the time they get down to low D and low C, they're happy to have the support of the contrabassoon that can play those notes more easily with more sustain, so that they don't have to worry about, killing their lungs trying to sustain these notes for extraordinary lengths of time.
So the MP Kev says, for a piece I received a string bass, I assume he means string bass part, they have a tremolo on a bass line. Would you try to imitate it on contrabassoon?
What, you mean you wouldn't just flutter tongue everything?
This makes the assumption that we'd be playing the double bass part. Now, I don't. If there's no contrabassoon part, I don't think you should be playing a contrabassoon on the piece. The composer didn't write for it. You don't have any reason to play an instrument the composer didn't write for.
So I will challenge that a little bit and say that in pedagogical settings, where the emphasis is more on players getting experience.
Okay,
I do think there's a little more value in saying, well, we have someone here who wants to learn contrabassoon. They can sit around doing nothing for 50% of rehearsal, or they can help bolster the basses.
But in that same regard, though, wouldn't that player also be playing regular bassoon?
Yeah,
you're not using contrabassoon as a pedagogical instrument usually.
Yeah, well, I'd argue it probably needs to be used more, considered more often in pedagogical settings than it is. But that is a good point, that might be an opportunity for the contrabassoonist to be working on their bassoon skills, even if they're just doubling even if they're playing in unison with another bassoonist. Once again, that's one of those things that in pedagogical settings is a little more understandable. Like, okay, if you have 5 flute players that really want to play an orchestra, and they're all capable of playing the part, sometimes the better option is to say, let's give 5 people some orchestral experience rather than only accept 2 and then make the other 3 just do nothing.
Yeah, or you rotate players in and out depending on the piece.
Now, MP Kev, this is actually pretty useful, pretty applicable to the topic of this piece. I do that fairly often in Pops concerts. So, like in an outdoor Pops concert, if I'm tacit for a full piece, a lot of times I'll just play the bass part or read off the second bassoon part and make up my own part based off of that. But once again, that's outdoor Pops concerts. Not something I would ever recommend doing in a main stage performance. Here, Brett, it might be a good opportunity for you to be horrified by something.
Is it your Tchaikovsky?
Yes, this is the contrabassoon part that I have made for the 1812 Overture. This is based off of... so I went through the whole piece and I took Tchaikovsky's inclination to use the second bassoon at the bottom of its range to double the bass line. And in those situations, I included the contrabassoon, but be able to play some of those low notes that you can't play on second bassoon. So like here, instead of jumping up a major seventh, the contrabassoon just goes down to A. This is not something that I would ever do in a indoor main stage concert. This is purely it's outdoors, I might as well keep myself occupied. Although I will say, the contrabassoon can come in handy in this part here, where you have the da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And like movie music concerts, a lot of times as a contrabassoonist, you get hired to play a Pops concert, like for movie music, and then you show up and then there's one piece in your folder that has a separate contrabassoon part and a whole bunch of other pieces that had contrabassoon in the original orchestration, but in the editions that have been prepared for mass consumption, the contrabassoon has been conveniently removed for the sake of selling more parts. So I have been known to just read off, or with the second bassoonist's consent, read off their music, and in passages where it makes sense to play the for it to be doubled an octave lower to join in. So like, what was it? So
haven't you done that in Firebird?
I haven't, but I want to. I do have it in my mind to. So for those of you who don't know, who just to be clear for everybody, Firebird was originally written for huge orchestra, and it was later compacted down to double winds. But it's often played by large orchestras where the third players just sit around doing nothing for that whole piece. So one thing that I want to do is prepare a slight re-expansion of Firebird, finding a middle ground between the kind of the extreme of the original version and the extreme of the reduced version to bring the triple winds in, because there's some nice moments in there for contrabassoon that got completely removed from the reduced version that's always performed these days. Brett, are you there?
I'm here, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I guess I just got so still you couldn't tell.
Yeah.
But no, I'm here.
Yeah. So the example I came up with. Oh, so Ratchet, Firebird, the original. Like, so if you go out and you buy a Dover edition of Firebird, that's the original.
1910, 1911.
That's the original version, because that's the one that's not under copyright protection. The one that version is never performed. When an orchestra performs Firebird, they're performing the reduction for double winds that Stravinsky did in the 40s or something.
It depends. There's the 1911 suite, there's the 1919 suite, and there's like the 1947 suite.
Yeah. So yeah, it's not going to, even though it looks like it's a giant orchestra in the easily accessible scores, it's almost never performed that way. But the example I came up with was I was hired to drive 5 hours to play Jingle Bells on a Christmas concert. Also on the program was a selection of Christmas-related movie music, which included excerpts from Nightmare Before Christmas. Beam, 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 beam. Now, the edition was prepared with high school orchestras in mind, so of course they didn't use contrabassoon. But I was sitting there on stage with nothing to do. I played the Nightmare Before Christmas excerpts from the second bassoon part because it's in the original orchestration. But I didn't play almost anything else from that excerpt or from that selection because I wasn't confident about the original orchestration, and I didn't want. Once again, I felt that was justifiable in making the performance better. I wasn't doing it so much to just keep myself occupied. The Tchaikovsky example over here is a little more, a little less defensible.
That's for outdoor performance only, where you're already there on stage.
Yeah.
And can't leave.
Yeah. And in this case, it's the last piece on the program. So you can't leave right. There's not enough time to leave, so you're just sitting there for the last piece, and then everyone stands up to do their encore, and then you're like, well, do I stand up? I didn't play the last piece. So, yeah. Once again, probably a musical sin, but a musical sin I am guilty of. Okay, so I think we've kind of covered everything we wanted to cover, or everything that I intended to cover, and I think we've gotten through the questions in the chat. So let's go ahead and call it a day. First of all, Brett, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely.
As we demonstrated, sometimes I need someone to tell me that I'm wrong.
I don't think we disagreed too much, though.
Well, the Prokofiev one, I will still defend the low B, low C sharp, but I at least understand that's one of the least defensible. Obviously, like several of these examples I came up with were like obviously you would play the version that the composer intended rather than the version that on the ink.
Right.
Okay. Well, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, they're asking about why you would perform one version of the Firebird versus the other. So the original Firebird is the full ballet, which is like 40 minutes long. The other versions are the suites, which are 15 minutes long, and I think therein lies the big difference. Are you performing a 15-minute version or a 40-minute version?
Yeah. Now, see, to me though, I do think that's the original. Take a piece like Petrushka, which has a similar situation where there's a larger and a smaller version. Usually, the smaller one gets performed simply because it has fewer people involved. So generally, orchestras aren't going to go out of their way to program works that require them to hire substitute players.
Right.
Now,
but then you get to Rite of Spring, and there's still two versions of it, but the orchestration is not changed.
Yeah. Yeah, now, there are pieces where there's not an option. Like, a lot of Strauss, if you want to play Strauss, you hire the big orchestra because that's how he wrote it. But in situations where the composer provided an alternative, a lot of times the alternative is tempting if it means you don't have to hire 20 substitute players to come in. Now, the reason why I don't like the double winds reduction of Firebird is because it gets played a lot of times by orchestras where there are 3 woodwind players or triple winds on stage or on the program playing that concert. It feels weird to remove them from the stage in order to play Firebird, a piece that was originally written for quadruple winds.
Right.
But you get into some very finicky questions. So as I've worked a little bit at expanding Firebird into triple winds, there are some thorny issues of, okay, well, when he reduced this, he also changed it a little bit. So do you try to re-expand the reduced version, or do you try to reduce the original version to triple winds? I mean, one way or another, you're going to enter the realm of arrangements. It would be an arrangement. It's not you're not discovering something the composer originally made. So I think you would have to be honest about that aspect of it and not try to pretend that, well, this is what Stravinsky really intended. But
Stravinsky is an odd case because there are, with many pieces, there are multiple versions.
Yeah, conveniently multiple versions released to extend copyright protection.
Yes.
Which is why when you go out to buy a Dover score, you can usually only find the originals, because even in countries where the
copyright's 50 years.
Yeah. Well, even in countries where the copyright of arrangements or urtext editions is ambiguous at best, companies like Dover just tend to say, I don't want to deal with that.
Yeah. It's like the early Stravinsky scores pre-1924 are only available as public domain in the United States. They aren't anywhere else.
Mm. Well, and then there's even this weird subset of pieces that were briefly public domain in the U.S. because we didn't like the Soviet Union,
Yes.
And
So a lot of Prokofiev and Shostakovich are that way.
yeah, so if you bought your study scores to Shostakovich and Prokofiev at the right time, they were really cheap.
Yes.
They're not so cheap anymore.
Yeah, I've got a Dover score to Shostakovich 9 and 10.
Yeah, I got the I have a Dover score to Alpine Symphony because oddly enough, some of Strauss was affected by extensions of copyright terms to the point where like for a little bit, Dover wasn't able to reprint Alpine Symphony because Strauss lived forever.
Well, he lived to 49, but that was published pre-1923. So that was always public domain in the U.S.
I'm not exactly certain the reason why. I just know that for a while it was unavailable, and the only way that I was able to get it is I found some random music store in some city that had one sitting on the shelf. So I just ordered it from them. I'd have to look in more closely. It might be bundled with something else.
Domestica, but that's even earlier. That's a 1904.
Okay. So yeah, I need to do some more research and figure out why exactly that might have been.
But all Strauss now, I believe he has entered public domain everywhere.
Okay. Well, that would be nice.
Even up to the late stuff. So I think as of this year, everything Strauss is public domain.
Okay. Well, yeah, because we're finally, for the first time in our lives, musical works are going to enter the public domain again.
Yeah.
That hasn't happened as long as I've been alive. Until like the past few years. So yeah, this is room for excitement.
So we've got stuff up to 1924 as public domain. Next year we'll get 25.
Yeah. Assuming they don't change it.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I know one idea I had was like a public domain celebration concert that, you know, maybe orchestras could, you know, program works that were recently entered the public domain, because I don't know, I think public domain gets a bad rap as some sort of like loophole that copyright really should be forever, but, you know, there's this annoying thing called public domain. And I feel like, you know, the original, the point of copyright was never to preserve intellectual property forever. The point of copyright was to give a limited license for your works. It was an exchange to say that we're going to give you exclusive performance rights to your work. If you want to, let me back up. If you want to share your work with the public, we're going to encourage that by giving you exclusive rights to that. And the trade-off is that eventually, you know, decades later, it's going to enter the public domain where it can become the artistic substrate of the next generation of artists. And I think
you've got to have that in order for art to grow. And I think in the 20th century and into the early 21st, we've had really a stagnation of a lot of artistic growth because of the restrictions of copyright.
Yeah, what was it? There was this really there was a graphic I saw once of, it was a bar chart of Amazon book sales by the year that it was originally written. And what you saw is an enormous explosion up to 1923, and then poof, nothing for several decades until you get into the more recent stuff. So there's decades that copyright law is failing of, you know, these works that weren't quite popular enough to make it out of rental libraries or to get second printings, but they're still under copyright protection, so they can't be enjoyed by anyone else. And I'm not saying that copyright is a great thing, but it has to end. Like, at some point, there has to be a sunset where it enters the public domain, and these works that have been neglected, forgotten, rotting on rental library shelves can have a second chance. Like people forget, at least in the U.S. Oh God, what's the name of that the Jimmy Stewart movie? It's a Wonderful Life. It's a Wonderful Life was forgotten. It was abandoned, and the first TV station to play it at Christmas time played it because no one bothered to renew the copyright, and then it became a part of American life because it was available. And
we wouldn't be talking about that movie if it were not for public domain.
Yeah. And anyway, so I think we've gotten into someone made a joke about the next ContraRants being copyright. I don't think we're going to go that far. I'd still like to kind of keep the topics on the overall topics on contrabassoon related things, but I'm happy to go off topic in the episodes. Yeah. And I do think copyright it's something that really impacts us as musicians, and not always in the way that the big publishing companies want to argue that it impacts us.
Right. It's both good and bad. It's a
trade-off.
Yeah.
Like before copyright, if you wanted to have control over your work, your option was, well, you can play it in your own house and never let anyone else hear it. Otherwise, if you perform it in the world, other people are going to hear it and they can do whatever they want with it. So that was a strong disincentive against creating art, or at least with sharing art with the public. We want people to share art, but we also want people to have have access to art with which to work. I mean, I think with this whole concept of intellectual property, this whole term, we've kind of lost sight of what a collaborative process art is, and it's a collaborative process across the generations. And when we pretend that every piece of art is one person sitting down in a vacuum and just ta-da creating art, we lose sight of the real process. How many?
And very rarely is it one person able to do everything.
Well, but I mean, even if they do, there's still whether they're purposefully following an earlier style or an earlier art form, or they're purposefully challenging and tearing down that art, they're still basing that off of something else that came before them.
Absolutely.
We're all part of. No one's doing it by themselves.
No, and I sit here as a composer, and you're involved with my current project right now. I am kind of the mastermind behind it, but we're recording my Symphony number 2, and we're recording it piece by piece with players around the world. And while I am the sole creator of it, I am not the sole artist involved. I couldn't be. It is absolutely a collaborative effort. And it's interesting to see as tracks come in how different people are interpreting different things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I think that's a little more unique to orchestral music, in that a composer of orchestral music is someone who writes a set of instructions that other people follow. There, like people that, like if you're recording a song, I mean, you can make a recording and do every part of it yourself and put that out in the world, and you can claim that was just me, that no one else collaborated on this process. But even then, you're taking advantage of the artistic infrastructure of public domain works.
Yeah. So nothing stands in isolation.
Dib says, this reminds me of stories of early jazz trumpet players covering their hands with a cloth so nobody could steal their fingerings. I haven't heard that anecdote, although I have encountered that mindset with some bassoonists.
I've heard about that with Hammond organ players, that they would never let anybody know exactly what settings they were using of their Hammond organ. If somebody came up and looked at it, they would shift everything out, and so nobody could ever see what settings they were using. So it's almost like they had copyrighted their own individual tone on the instrument.
Well, and see, we do have, like, in U.S. law, there's the concept of a trade secret, which, as long as you keep it secret, it's fine. Or you have control over it as long as you can keep it a secret, but the moment you can't keep it a secret, it's out. And I think that, sometimes people get a little, I don't know. I mean, like, last week I was streaming my fingering chart that I released on the
Creative Commons.
Yeah, Creative Commons. That's more my mindset of, well, for one thing,
educational material should be free.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's anything wrong with charging it. I just felt like, for my purposes, it was better to have it free and accessible. But even then, there's this concept of there used to be this big fight over maps. Could you copyright a map? So they would do this thing where maps would make fake cities,
paper towns,
and they would use these to catch people that were stealing their map. And I think eventually the decision came down that you can copyright the layout of a map, but you can't copyright the information contained within a map. And I would argue the same, like, you cannot copyright facts. The fact is, when I press a certain combination of keys on this particular instrument, that note comes out. I could copyright a pretty graphic demonstrating that. That might get copyright protection, but the fingering that I use, that is an acoustic fact of the instrument and should not be copyrightable.
Yeah.
Yes, Ratchet. Dictionaries have done that too, made fake words to catch people copying the dictionary, trying to claim copyright on the dictionary. And then, I mean, Brett, I'm sure you've heard of these stories of people, like, using a computer algorithm to generate every possible melody and then just copywriting all of it just as a protest against copyright.
Well, actually, what they didn't copyright them. They did that and put them in the public domain.
See, the one I remember back from when I was in high school was what was it?
The most recent one, anyway, is they created every possible melody using however many notes, and then they said, okay, here's all 11 billion of them in the public domain.
Oh, okay, yeah. So this is a little outdated, but this is what I was thinking of from when I was in high school. This organization went through and they used an algorithm to generate every melody that was created by dialing a telephone number on touchtone phones. So anyone who dialed a telephone number was committing a copyright violation by performing their copywritten work. And of course, this wasn't serious. This was a protest against over. Sometimes decisions about patents and copyrights are being made by people that don't really understand the artistic arguments or the scientific arguments at work. And this was a protest against that, I feel.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I think I did see what you're talking about, where someone just went through and copywrote all the melodies.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so I think that's going to be it. I think we've gotten thoroughly off topic, but in a good way.
Yeah.
Brett, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, absolutely.
And if anyone's interested in seeing my video game live stream where we're going to be messing with hex editors and spreadsheets to break the music of Zelda for the original NES, that's going to be tomorrow at 2 p.m. Thank you all for listening, and thanks again to Brett for joining us.
Thanks, guys.